Marching in that first Pride was exciting, daring, and indeed quite nerve-wracking. We didn't know whether we were going to be arrested or queer bashed. We were hoping for the best, but every step of the way we were looking over our shoulder, looking at the public reactions, but very much determined to carry on regardless. The Stonewall riots took place at the Stonewall Bar in New York in late June 1969. They were a reaction to decades of police harassment. On this particular night, when the police came by to bully the gay customers, they fought back. Indeed, there were 3 nights of rioting against the way in which the police were corrupt and were harassing LGBT plus people. And those riots really were the incident that kickstarted the modern LGBT plus movement. As a result of those riots and the arrests that took place, the LGBT plus community in New York got organized, and very soon afterwards we saw the birth of the Gay Liberation Front in New York.
And then how did that reach you in London?
I never heard about the Stonewall riots, but I did hear about the protest a few weeks later, organized by the Gay Liberation Front in New York. That inspired me and many others to come together, and the result was the formation of the Gay Liberation Front in London. Although we took the name from the New York organization, we were our own unique creation. We were inspired by them, but we were very much rooted in the British LGBT plus community and our history and culture.
And just describe for me what life was like in 1970 in London being gay.
Back then, although there had been a partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in England and Wales in 1967, it was very limited. Most aspects of gay male life still remained criminalised. So I, as a teenage gay man in London, was committing a criminal act if I had consenting sex with another man, because I was under the lawful age of consent of 21. So it was okay for heterosexual couples to have sex from the age of 16, but for gay and bisexual men, we were expected to wait until we were 21. And if we did have sex before that age, we could be put in a young offenders institution for 2 years. Also, in that era, there were no positive role models for gay people. The only images were of ultra camp comedians like Larry Grayson and John Inman. The only time a gay person would be mentioned in the news is if they're exposed as a child molester, a spy, or a serial killer. The medical and psychiatric professions designated homosexuality as an illness, and they were still practicing electric shock aversion therapy in those days to try and cure homosexuality. In schools, LGBT plus kids got no support. There was virtually no action against bullying of LGBT plus pupils, and gay teachers were often sacked. They were deemed to be a threat and a danger to children. Of course, there was no legal recognition for same-sex partners. So if your partner died, you had no next of kin rights, no right to inherit the property you shared and built together. It was very, very grim. Although there had been a partial limited decriminalisation of homosexuality, people mistakenly think that homosexuality was legalised in 1967. It wasn't. That was a very partial, limited decriminalisation. And in the years afterwards, the police harassment intensified, and the number of gay and bisexual men convicted for consenting behaviour increased by over 400%.
And then tell me about then, against that backdrop of everything, the picture that you paint, going from joining the Gay Liberation Front is one thing. Taking part in a march was a very visible thing to do. How did that come about? What was the thinking behind organising that first Pride March, and how you felt when the march set off on that first Saturday in July 1972?
I was one of about 30 or 40 people in the Gay Liberation Front who organised Britain's first ever Gay Pride Parade, which took place on the 1st of July 1972. We came up with the idea of Gay Pride to counter the prevailing consensus that we should be ashamed of who we are. And that was a huge gamble, because back then most LGBT plus people were in the closet. They would not dare show their faces in public because they feared arrest, being beaten up by queer bashers, losing their jobs, being evicted from their homes by homophobic landlords. So when we decided to hold this first ever Pride Parade, we had no idea how many people would turn out. In the end, about 700 people showed up. And we were delighted. But we were very heavily policed. This is just a very leisurely, peaceful, carnival-style parade through the streets. We were not threatening anybody, but the police, had very large numbers on the protest march, and some of the officers were openly homophobic. They would abuse us as puffs, queers, faggots, lessies, dykes. Not all officers did that, but some did. And of course, back then, there was no police complaints procedure. They could get away with it. But we were nevertheless, we were defiant. We were determined to make our mark. And for us, that first Pride was about showing that we were proud of who we are, but also about queer visibility, staking our claim on the public space, and celebrating our culture, our lives, but also very much a protest. We were very much committed to the idea that this Pride was not just a party or a celebration, which it was in part, but also a protest for our human rights.
And then how did it evolve over time? And I mean, it's almost sort of Sorry, go on.
I'm going to finish that, yeah. The response from members of the march went from Trafalgar Square via Charing Cross Road and Oxford Street to Hyde Park, where we held a gay day. A gay day was a queer picnic. Everybody bought food, drink, dope, and music. We had a great fun time. I remember the police lining up on the side of the park with their arms folded, glowering. They particularly hated it. We played various party games like Spin the Bottle. So there's lots of same-sex kissing, which in those days was, you could be arrested for kissing a person of the same sex. But the police, given our numbers, the police did not dare to arrest us. But we were certainly nervous. We were nervous. We feared that they might arrest us. En route, the reaction from members of the public on the pavement was very interesting. I would say about a third were hostile, some even abusive. About a third just gawped in disbelief that gay people would dare show their faces. And about a third were to varying degrees supportive. A few even clapped and cheered. So that gave us confidence. We thought, wow, a third of the public is more or less on our side. That's a good starting point. And because the whole event was a great success, that emboldened us to repeat Pride the next year, the year after, and the year after.
Because I suppose when you did it the first time, you didn't think, "Oh, I wonder if we'll still be doing this in 50 years' time." But how do you feel now, looking back over that 50 years? And has it achieved what the young, idealistic Peter Tatchell wanted to achieve 50 years ago?
Marching in that first Pride was exciting, daring, and indeed quite nerve-wracking. We didn't know whether we were going to be arrested or queer bashed. We were hoping for the best, but every step of the way we were looking over our shoulder, looking at the public reactions, but very much determined to carry on regardless. For the first few years, Pride remained quite small, only about 2,000 or 3,000 people. By the mid-1980s, it had increased to 15,000. Then in 1988, the Conservative government enacted Section 28, the first new anti-gay law in Britain for a century. It prohibited the so-called promotion of homosexuality by local authorities. Well, that was a red rag. Overnight, the numbers on the Pride Parade doubled to 30,000 in 1988. And then each year afterwards increased exponentially. So that by 1997, there were 100,000 people in the Pride Parade. It took 5 or 6 hours to pass a single point. And at the post-March festival on Clapham Common, there were nearly 300,000 people. Sadly, because Pride had become so huge, much bigger than the organisers expected, they lost some money in 1997. And this led to a group of gay businessmen stepping in to take it over and to rebrand it as Mardi Gras. For the first time, making people pay to go to the post-March festival. That really alienated a lot of people. So the numbers fell very dramatically, both on the march and at the festival. About a decade ago, the organisation of Pride was taken over by a community interest company, basically a private company, a group of individuals who tendered to the Mayor of London and got the contract. But they are not democratically elected by the community, and there is a lot of anxiety about the way in which Pride now is very corporate, very commercial, and mostly very apolitical. So in recent years, LGBT plus human rights demands have barely figured in the parade. And that's been a conscious choice by the organisers. They've also limited the number of marchers under pressure from Westminster City Council to a mere 30,000 people. 30,000 in one of the biggest, gayest cities in the world. That is the smallest Pride parade. That makes London one of the smallest Pride parades of any Western capital city, including some very small countries. It's utterly shameful that Westminster Council has imposed this artificial cap on the numbers who can participate, which means that every year tens of thousands of LGBT plus people and our straight friends and allies are turned away. They're not allowed to march. That is completely against the roots of Pride, which is always meant to be open to everyone.
I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned the sort of the commercialisation of it. One of the things that you sort of see around, particularly around London, when in the run-up to Pride, suddenly every bank and building society and coffee shop has changed their logo to a rainbow flag. I mean, to some extent, that's a sign, I suppose, that society's moved on. But is there a sort of, I don't know if rainbow washing's the right word, but a sort of slight sense of companies without maybe the greatest record of where they operate or the people that they employ change their logo for a week as a sign of, oh, we've done our bit?
There is a concern that some of the companies are using rainbow branding as a way of selling their product, that they're using it as a marketing exercise to win over pink consumers.
I just want to ask you as well about trans rights, which has become such a political football. Actually, lots of people who aren't trans arguing about something constantly very angrily on social media and so on. How does that make you feel? Does it remind you of what it was like to be gay in the early 70s? And this, the trans community is now going through similar battles. Is it better or worse than that? What's your take on that political discourse?
Much of the hostility and arguments against trans people today echoes the kinds of things that were said against lesbian and gay people 30 or 40 years ago. Trans women are being demonized as a threat to other women, when in fact, like other women, they also suffer from misogyny, discrimination, rape, and hate crime.
Just finally, then, what do you hope Pride might look like in another 50 years' time? Do you sort of almost hope it doesn't exist because gay rights is seen as such a, everyone's achieved equality? What would be the long-term hope? Looking the young aspirational Peter Tatchells of today, what does life look like in 50 years' time?
We still need Pride today because there are still some LGBT plus people in this country who have internalized homophobia, biophobia, and transphobia. They don't feel good about themselves. They do feel ashamed. So reasserting pride in who we are is still important. Plus, there are issues like the ban on conversion therapy, reform of the Gender Recognition Act, a better deal for LGBT plus refugees fleeing persecution. These are still ongoing issues. And of course, internationally, the battle is still so far to go. There are 69 countries that continue to criminalize same-sex relations. Some have life imprisonment. A handful, 12 Muslim majority countries, still have the death penalty. The battle for LGBT plus rights on a global scale is still far from won. But my ultimate hope is that one day pride will be unnecessary, that it will become redundant, because the acceptance and equal rights for LGBT plus people will be the norm.